I never thought I'd see the day when a freshly painted car in my own driveway could spark a firestorm. But there I was, standing by the curb at dawn, as a flustered neighbor marched across my lawn wielding a clipboard and a scowl that could wilt an oak. She was my neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. Let's call her Karen, though she had a perfectly nice name. Truth be told, I'd always been on her good side until the day she decided the color of my car wasn't HOA approved and needed to be towed away. Sound ridiculous? Well, buckle in, because you haven't heard anything yet. I live in a suburban development called Fox Hollow Estates. The estates part is laughable. It's a series of modest ranch homes and split levels built in the 1970s, before HOAs got quite so draconian. We're a quiet bunch, mostly folks in their 50s, 60s, and beyond, enjoying grandchildren's visits, early retirement, and the occasional block party potluck where we all pretend we're still 25. For the most part, neighbors here are friendly. We borrow sugar. We wave at each other from our mailboxes. We swap stories of the good old days. But one corner of the neighborhood has always been different. That's Karen's turf. She moved in about a year ago. She's 50-ish, immaculately coiffed, and constantly toggling between friendly neighbor and uncompromising HOA president. That's right. The day she arrived, she ran unopposed to become the new head honcho of the Homeowners Association. She replaced dear old Larry, who spent most of his tenure ignoring trivial complaints and letting folks live in peace. But once Karen took over, it was immediate change. New restrictions on mailbox colors, yard decorations, and yes, even an official inquiry into permissible vehicle paint hues. I suppose I flew under her radar for a while. My lawn was trimmed, my hedges neat, and my mailbox was already the neutral shade she wanted. But trouble began the moment I decided to repaint my car. Granted, it was an unusual choice. I had a 1986 Pontiac Fiero, a throwback to my younger years when sports cars felt rebellious and thrilling. It used to be a plain maroon, but the paint was peeling after so many summers outside. I thought, why not do something fun? So I hired a local body shop to paint it in a bold, gleaming shade called Tropical Wine, a deep metallic burgundy with a hint of shimmer in the sun. I parked it proudly in my driveway, stood back to admire the glossy finish, and felt all of 18 again. It was just a car, but apparently, to Karen, it was also a violation. A knock on my door the next day turned into a confrontation I'll never forget. Karen, with her shiny hair sprayed into place, slapped a newsletter in my hand. This is the updated color guideline for vehicles visible from the street, she told me with a triumphant kind of glint in her eye. I looked down at the typed list. Beige, white, gray, black, navy blue. Bland, unimaginative, typical. My new color wasn't on the list. I was struck speechless. Since when did an HOA have the power to dictate a car's paint job? I'd heard of strict HOAs before, but controlling a person's car color felt like a comedic stretch. Still, comedic or not, Karen was not joking. I'm giving you 2 weeks to address this violation, she declared. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll have to involve towing services. I blinked. You're going to tow my car for being the wrong color? She set her jaw. The guidelines are in place for a reason. Uniformity and property value preservation. People need to feel comfortable that no one's going rogue with neon pinks or polka dots. I tried to reason with her. Neon pink is a far cry from burgundy. It's not an eyesore. It's not even bright. Karen pursed her lips. I'm sorry, but that's final. She handed me a copy of the bylaw changes she and her small board had penned. Either you paint your car an approved color or keep it in the garage, out of sight. That was the first time I'd heard of a ban on unapproved vehicle colors. I sputtered that I'd never gotten a memo about the new rules, but she swiftly pointed out a mailer that had apparently gone out last month. I must have thrown it away, assuming it was just another HOA invitation to a yard sale or a volunteer trash pickup. In my defense, nobody else seemed aware of it either. Karen and her board had slid the new regulation into the fine print of an otherwise boring newsletter. So there I stood, absorbing the surreal threat of losing my car, on the say-so of this brand-new, self-appointed sheriff in town. I'm not going to have it repainted again, I said firmly. And it doesn't fit in my garage because I converted it into a workshop years ago. That's my woodworking space. If you tow it, you'd better be prepared for a fight. Karen only offered a curt nod and marched away. I watched her stride down the sidewalk, passing lawns and gardens as if she owned the entire street. I figured that was the end of it for the day, but I should have known better than to underestimate an HOA president on a mission. I wasn't going to budge. I just poured a chunk of savings into that paint job, and I loved the vibrant feel of it. A car's color doesn't hurt anyone. It isn't a decibel violation, it doesn't block traffic, and it certainly doesn't lower anyone's property value. Any real estate agent worth their salt can confirm that one odd car in a driveway won't torpedo the market. Little did I know, Karen was prepared to escalate, and I was about to be dragged into a battle that would take me right to the brink of losing my beloved Pontiac Fiero. 2 weeks. That's what I had, per Karen's official warning. Every day, I'd look out my window in the morning, half expecting to see a tow truck creeping down the street. My nerves were on edge. Even though the warning period was still ticking, my gut told me that Karen might pull a fast one, especially since she was known for ambushing neighbors over minor offenses. By the end of the first week, I'd grown tired of feeling powerless and decided to dig into the HOA's bylaws. I never bothered reading them before. My focus over the years had been paying the monthly dues and keeping my yard tidy. However, late one Thursday evening, I brewed a pot of coffee and settled into my recliner with the HOA binder on my lap. The cover was dusty. The pages inside looked like they were typed in the 1980s. There were sections on fence height, exterior paint colors for houses, how far your trash bins needed to be from the curb, and other mundane items. Nothing about car colors. That is, until I flipped to a set of newly inserted pages. They were clearly printed in a different font and style. The heading read Vehicle Aesthetic Guidelines. Beneath it, I saw Karen's signature along with 2 other board members. Tucked inside the text was a line stating, all vehicles parked in driveways or visible from the street must be limited to the following color palette: black, white, gray, silver, or navy blue. Any deviations, it said, would be subject to fines or towing. I nearly choked on my coffee. So it was real. She had spelled out exactly how she wanted the entire neighborhood's cars to look. The date on that page was from just a few weeks prior to my new paint job. My guess was they'd quietly enacted the regulation, hoping no one would notice. I'd bet actual money that people with red or green cars were simply ignoring the rule or had no clue it existed. Sure enough, as I drove around the neighborhood the next morning, I counted at least 5 other houses with non-compliant car colors. There was a hunter green Subaru at the Becker's place, a bright red Mustang at the Sanchez home, and a dusty gold minivan at the Cortlands. They were all older folks who, like me, rarely paid attention to HOA drama. Strangely, none of them seemed to be getting threatened with towing yet. I started chatting with a few of the neighbors to see if they'd received any warnings. The Beckers said no. The Sanchez's said no. The Cortlands said no. Everyone shrugged, baffled at how this new rule had passed. One neighbor confided, Karen's been going after people she personally doesn't like. Don't you remember when she had that feud with you over your backyard shed last spring? Indeed, Karen had once complained that my workshop's roofline was too tall, but that dispute ended when a city inspector found nothing wrong. I was starting to realize that this had less to do with color palettes and more to do with a personal vendetta. Karen was targeting me because we hadn't clicked from day one. Maybe my independence rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was the way I called out her nonsense at last month's neighborhood meeting about mandatory potted plants on every porch. I had no proof, but I suspected that was the real reason. Instead of laying low, I decided to be proactive. I talked to some of the other folks with unapproved colors to see if we could band together. But they were anxious and wary of stirring trouble. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Yates, was so rattled by Karen's tactics that she was afraid to sign any kind of petition. I can't handle the stress, she told me gently, glancing at her pale blue sedan parked outside. I think I'm just going to pay for a paint job that fits her silly rules. Lord knows I don't need a tow truck carrying my car off. It broke my heart to see her bullied like that. Time was running short, and I knew that if Karen wanted to tow my car, she could call a company anytime after the official 2-week grace period ended. That gave me a narrow window to figure out a plan. One promising angle: The HOA, by state law, had to follow certain protocols. They couldn't single me out unless they documented every other violation in the neighborhood. If I could prove that the rule was selectively enforced, then I could stop the tow based on discrimination or improper enforcement. But that would mean collecting evidence, photos, statements, maybe even minutes from board meetings. And doing that in just a matter of days felt impossible. The pressure kept mounting. On the 10th day, I spotted Karen pacing on the sidewalk in front of my house, phone in hand, glaring at my parked Fiero as though it were a personal affront. My heart pounded in my chest. I remember stepping outside to confront her. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my tone level. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Just documenting the violation. We have to keep records of these things," she said, waving her phone camera in the air. "After all, next week your time is up." The casual cruelty of her tone made my blood boil. Trying to remain calm, I said, "You realize you'll need a court order or at least a formal towing notice, right? You can't just have my property taken." "I have rights." She sniffed, adjusting her immaculate blazer. "We're following HOA guidelines. If you refuse to comply, the association has the authority to tow. Perhaps you should refresh yourself on the terms you agreed to upon purchasing your home. This is all standard procedure." I bit my tongue, want to blast her for using the HOA like a personal dictatorship. Instead, I made a choice to respond more strategically. "If I can't stop you, then I guess I'll see you in court," I said quietly. "Because I'm not going to let my car go without a fight." Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, maybe? Or annoyance. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched away. As I watched her go, the stress tied my stomach in knots. I had no interest in a legal battle that could drag on for months or cost me more than the value of my car. And yet, the thought of caving to her demands filled me with an even sharper dread. I couldn't just let her win. I had rights, didn't I? Wasn't there someone who could help me? I decided to call Larry, the former HOA president. Though he was retired from the board, he'd lived in Fox Hollow Estates for decades and knew the ropes. Maybe, just maybe, he could tell me how to proceed. When he answered, he sounded alarmed. "Goodness, you're the second person to call me about that new rule." Frankly, I'm flabbergasted. Nothing about it sounds legitimate. We chatted for nearly an hour. Larry explained that major bylaw changes typically required a vote by all homeowners, or at least a quorum. He suspected Karen had quietly snuck her vehicle color rule through, marking it as a minor revision so that it only needed approval from the small, hand-picked board. If that was the case, then it might not hold up under scrutiny. I felt a surge of hope. If Larry was right, there was a real chance I could win, if I was willing to stand up to the intimidation. I gave him my thanks, hung up, and decided to get to work. Perhaps I could gather signatures from other neighbors or push for an emergency meeting to challenge this. The clock was ticking, and I knew I had to move fast. What I didn't realize was that Karen had a head start. She called a tow company the moment my 2 weeks ended. The next few days would be one wild roller coaster. The dreaded day arrived sooner than I'd hoped. Exactly 14 days after Karen's warning, I woke up early to the rumble of a large engine outside. My heart jumped into my throat. I raced to the window, and, sure enough, there it was, a bulky tow truck idling by the curb, flashing lights reflecting off my Fiero's glossy burgundy paint. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, lips pressed tight in satisfaction. A second man, presumably the driver, hopped out of the truck and started checking the license plate. I bolted to the door and hurried onto the lawn, ignoring the chilly morning air biting at my pajamas. "Hold it right there," I shouted, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "That's my car, and you have no legal right to tow it." Karen turned, raising her clipboard like a shield. "This is a properly authorized tow," she announced, her voice loud enough for the entire block to hear. "Your vehicle is in violation of the HOA bylaws, and you've failed to comply by the deadline. Please step aside, or I'll have to call the authorities." My mind raced. I had a folder of documents inside, with notes from Larry and evidence of other cars in the neighborhood that also didn't match the approved colors. But in that moment, I only had my phone and my unwavering resolve. I tried to gather my nerves. "I'm calling the police," I declared. And you'd better believe that if you tow this car without proper authorization, I'll sue for property damage." Karen gave a dismissive wave. "Fine. Call the police. We have a valid contract with the towing company, and the local authorities have no say over HOA mandates." The tow truck driver, a burly man in a black jacket, looked uneasy. He wasn't an officer, after all, and probably didn't want a legal headache. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his cap, "I just go where I'm told. If there's some dispute, maybe we should hold off. I'm just following the service request." Karen spun on him. "We pay you to do a job. This vehicle is clearly on the tow list. If you don't do it, I'll find a towing service that will." Trembling with anger, I whipped out my phone and dialed 911. I calmly told the dispatcher that someone was attempting to remove my property without valid authorization. The dispatcher sounded wary. HOA disputes aren't typically a police matter, but I insisted an officer be sent to sort it out peacefully. Meanwhile, Karen glared at me, certain I'd back down any second. What happened next felt surreal. A small crowd of neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk. Some peered from windows. A few wandered over in slippers and robes. I spotted old Mrs. Yates, arms wrapped tight around herself, eyeing the confrontation with wide eyes. And then there were the Beckers, the Sanchezes, and a handful of others, looking ready to intervene. One older gentleman, Vince, who'd lived here longer than anyone, approached Karen. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "This is nonsense. Towing a car over its paint color? This has gone too far." Karen raised her eyebrows. "It's an official bylaw, Vince, and we're within our rights." Vince scowled. "I never voted on that. Did you call a neighborhood meeting? Or did you slip that rule in under the radar?" At that, Karen's face darkened. "That's none of your concern," she snapped. "We followed the proper procedure." But a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. Just then, the police arrived, 2 officers stepping out of cruiser. They calmly approached us, listening to Karen's explanation and then my side of the story. I showed them the rowdy tow truck, the brand new color rule, and the original HOA bylaws. When Karen tried to speak over me, the taller officer hushed her. "Ma'am, we need to hear both sides." I explained that I believed the bylaw change was illegitimate, not voted on by the majority of homeowners. I also argued that the HOA was selectively enforcing it, as there were multiple cars of disapproved colors that weren't being towed. "This is harassment," I said, frustration creeping into my tone. "She's targeting me personally." The second officer scratched his chin. "Well, the police can't enforce HOA rules, but we can intervene if there's a dispute over property rights. If you believe this towing is illegal, we can ask the towing company to hold off until a civil court or the HOA board clarifies the rule. The last thing we want is them towing your car and then being liable for damages if the rule is found unenforceable." Karen's jaw tensed. "The rule is clear and enforceable. I have a contract with the towing company. They're here because he's in violation." The first officer looked at her, unimpressed. "Ma'am, you might want to consult your HOA's legal counsel before proceeding. If this is challenged and found to be outside proper HOA procedure, your board could be liable for damages, and that can get very expensive." The tow truck driver suddenly piped up. "Look, I don't need a lawsuit. If the owner isn't consenting, and the cops are telling me this might be unlawful, I'm not hooking this car up until you show me some solid legal paperwork." Silence fell over the crowd. Karen's face reddened as she rummaged in her clipboard for any official document. An order from a judge, a court order, something that would give the tow company bulletproof authority. But of course, she had nothing of the sort. Her only proof was the newly minted bylaw that may not have even been legally approved. She stammered. "This is the official text. It's valid," but everyone around her could see the cracks in her confidence. The officers stood their ground, effectively blocking the tow unless Karen could produce evidence that her bylaw was enforceable. Meanwhile, the driver gave an apologetic shrug, climbed back into his truck, and radioed his supervisor. I let out a slow breath, relief washing over me. For the moment, my car was safe. The police told me they'd file a brief report on the incident, and Karen had no choice but to stand down. The gathered neighbors began murmuring among themselves. Some shot me sympathetic looks. Others glared at Karen for the chaos she'd caused. Red-faced, Karen sputtered at me. "You've made a big mistake. The board will pursue this further." Then she turned on her heels, clipping down the sidewalk, her perfect hair bouncing with every furious step. Vince patted me on the shoulder. "Good job standing up to her. I'm sick of her bullying." Mrs. Yates nodded in agreement, tears of relief shining in her eyes. Maybe she was safe from a forced repaint, too. When the dust settled, I returned inside to gather myself. My heart was still pounding. I knew I'd won a temporary victory, but Karen likely wasn't done. She was too proud, too controlling, and too resentful to drop the matter. If she couldn't use a tow truck, she'd probably find another angle. Fines, lawsuits, whatever it took. Little did she know, I'd already been working behind the scenes. While she'd plotted her early morning ambush, I called Larry again, who advised me to demand a special HOA membership meeting. He told me that if I could gather enough neighbor signatures and show the board was violating its own bylaws, I'd stand a good chance of having the new car color rule voided. But it wouldn't be easy. Karen had stacked the board with her loyal friends. Still, I got my first taste of victory, and I suspected something bigger was coming. Karen's downfall might be right around the corner if the rest of the neighbors came together. Over the next several days, word of the botched towing attempt spread fast. It turned out that while Karen had a handful of allies on the HOA board, 2 friends she'd convinced to join, she'd also made quite a few enemies among the general membership. Residents bristled at her endless rule changes, designated weed height for lawns, the ban on certain types of patio furniture, and now car color restrictions. The towing incident, so brazen and public, was the last straw for many. I took Larry's advice and circulated a petition calling for an emergency HOA meeting. With Vince's help, we knocked on doors throughout Fox Hollow Estates. We talked to folks who were fed up with Karen's petty demands and subtle intimidation. Some were older retirees who just wanted to enjoy their twilight years in peace. Others, like me, were still working and had no patience for constant harassment about the color of our cars. It didn't take long to collect enough signatures. By midweek, we had far more than the required number for an emergency meeting. Karen tried to block the motion, claiming it was procedurally invalid, but with Larry's guidance, I cited the exact HOA bylaw that allowed members to force a meeting if a certain percentage signed off. She had no choice but to schedule it. We gathered in the local community center on a crisp Saturday morning. The room was packed. More than 50 residents showed up, an unusually high turnout. Karen sat at the front, flanked by her 2 board supporters, looking tense but determined. I took a seat near the front. My car was parked right outside the window, gleaming in all its tropical wine glory, a subtle reminder of what had sparked this revolt. Larry opened the meeting. He was allowed to moderate as a former president, since so many requested a fair voice, and introduced the main agenda, the so-called vehicle aesthetic guidelines. One by one, neighbors spoke up, expressing frustration, disbelief, and anger over Karen's attempt to tow my car simply for being burgundy. Several folks pointed out that their own cars didn't meet the color rule, yet they hadn't been targeted. Eventually, Karen rose to defend herself. She claimed she was only doing her duty, that the community needed uniformity, and that she believed the bylaw had been fairly introduced. But the crowd wasn't buying it. People demanded to see the official voting record that supposedly passed the new rule. That's when things got really interesting. Her 2 board allies, shifting nervously, produced a typed sheet indicating they'd voted among themselves. It showed that the board had voted 3-0 to implement the rule. Gasps rippled through the room. Larry explained calmly, "For a bylaw change this significant, the entire HOA membership should have been notified and granted a vote. That's our standard procedure, spelled out in Section 6 of our charter. A simple board vote is only valid for minor changes, not for new color restrictions on personal property." Karen's face drained of color as she realized the entire membership was hearing a direct contradiction to her claims. Some neighbors demanded the rule be struck down immediately. Others wanted Karen to resign for overstepping her authority and nearly causing a wrongful towing. Amid the commotion, one neighbor raised the question of potential liability. If the tow truck had taken that Fiero, and it was deemed an improper towing, the HOA would be on the hook for the damages. We'd all be paying for Karen's vendetta out of our dues. That suggestion triggered an uproar. People were furious at the idea of their hard-earned money being used to clean up a mistake Karen had orchestrated. The room filled with raised voices calling for the rule's repeal and for Karen's removal as president. Larry, ever the voice of reason, tapped the microphone. Let's keep this orderly. We need a clear motion. Does anyone move to invalidate the so-called vehicle aesthetic guidelines? Vince's hand shot up. I move to invalidate it entirely and remove it from the bylaws. A second came quickly from another neighbor. All in favor? Larry asked. The response was nearly unanimous. A resounding chorus of "aye" rang out. Karen tried to protest, but the vote was clear. The illegal rule was struck down. The meeting wasn't done, though. A second motion was introduced to hold a recall vote for Karen's position as HOA president. The tension in the room was thick as an early morning fog. The same people who just abolished her rule now wanted her gone from aboard. She spluttered, demanding that the vote be postponed or that the membership abide by some archaic rule about notice. But Larry calmly explained that under an emergency meeting, it was permissible to hold such a vote if 2/3 of members present agreed. The next words out of Larry's mouth were, "All in favor of removing Karen from her role as HOA president?" The wave of hands that went up was staggering. People who never normally took sides in conflicts were raising their hands, outraged by her overreach. Karen's two loyalists tried to keep their hands down, but it was a lost cause. The motion passed with over 80% in favor. Stunned into silence, Karen stood there, cheeks flushed. She glanced around the room, searching for support, but found little beyond her two friends. Finally, she gathered her purse and clipboard and stormed out without a word, leaving behind an auditorium of relieved neighbors. An interim board was quickly established, with Larry helping to guide the transition until official elections could be held. As folks filed out, many approached me, patting my back or shaking my hand. Some just whispered, "Thank you for standing up to her." It felt surreal and gratifying. The hostility, the stress, the fear of losing my car, it had all culminated in an outcome I never expected. The entire community stood up against the pettiness and took back their HOA. For all the chaos Karen caused, she inadvertently united the neighborhood in a way that potlucks and block parties never had. Even Mrs. Yates, who usually steered clear of any controversy, confessed how relieved she was. "That woman was out of control," she said, pointing to her pale blue sedan. "I'm too old to worry about my car being non-compliant. Now I can rest easy." In the end, the real lesson wasn't just that I got to keep my burgundy Fiero in the driveway. Although for me, that was a sweet victory. It was that an HOA only has as much power as the members allow. Once the neighbors decided they'd had enough, Karen's reign was finished. So, that's the story of how an overzealous HOA, Karen, tried to tow my car over its color and ended up being towed out of her own position instead. If this resonates with you, or if you're facing similar HOA troubles, remember that knowledge is power. Know your bylaws, rally your neighbors, and don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. Unity can topple even the most tyrannical board president.